Hi, welcome back to this fourth video on the SDG budget tag for Seychelles. So far, what we have done in the previous videos has been to, on the one hand, provide context on when is an SDG budget tag useful, and then we also did a specific tagging. If you remember, we did it first at the narrative level. That's an important component. Do first a narrative component and a narrative alignment to SDG targets based on the on the objectives of a project or an expense line. Based on those on that narrative tagging, we did some examples in the case of the Ministry of Finance, Department of Finance, and how that translates into the specific file. We also covered the extent to which in the video that followed to that, um, the extent to which we can create SDG financing from non-administrative expenses. That's the last video that we did. So that's what that's what we have done so far. But there is a significant component related to administrative expenses, and that's the objective of this video. Usually, what we see around the world is that a country's budget is usually 80, 70 to 80 to 90%, in some cases, is just pure administrative expenses. And so, what that tells us is that if you remove administrative expenses from the equation, it will be very hard to have a thorough overview of the budget on the direction of a country's budget. So that's why in this case, we want to make sure that we don't forget administrative expenses. And that's one of the added values of this methodology, that we want to take into account administrative expenses. The way we do that is that we take the non-administrative expenses, and we remember that they all need to have an administrative expense behind it. Think about it in terms of the education sector. There is not a single program or most programs within the education sector, as well as in any other sector. Any program needs to have an administrative support behind it, right? Think about it in terms of a country wanting uh, um, to have to achieve better scores at the international level, test scores at the international level for the education sector. In that case, what goes into the how do we make or how do we turn around policy making so that students get better in their test scores, that's up to non-administrative projects. But that program, in order for that program to be successful, for students to have better test scores at the international or national level, we need to, for instance, pay teachers. We also need to build infrastructure. We need to make sure that services are running through the adequately running through the schools. So this could be electricity, this could be running water, uh, right? Lunches, snacks, that kind of logistics. So that's what we mention when we say that we want administrative expenses to chase or emulate or support what's happening at the non-administrative level. That's one of the innovations for this methodology, and it's an important one to make because it's the cornerstone of what we're going to do right here. Um, so in this case, as I mentioned, we want to have a treatment of administrative expenses that emulates the behavior of non-administrative expenses. In some other countries, they call non-administrative expenses simply investment, because it could be not in terms of infrastructure, but rather using the OECD definition of investment that is related to um, things from infrastructure, but also take into account things such as education to continue with the same example that we just provided. So based on that, we want non-administrative expenses to provide us a guide to tell us what kind of distribution, what's happening in those expenses that can actually have some direction. Usually, what happens with administrative expenses is that governments cannot control much of what's happening there. But with the non-administrative expenses, those are the ones where the government can sort of give a direction to those kind of expenses. So in this case, as I mentioned, we do want to have we want to tabulate the distribution of non-administrative resources and extrapolate that same distribution. That's why you see the same percentages to administrative expenses. In this case, we have three examples of administrative expenses: asset acquisition, salaries, and payroll taxes. And so we want to be able to map first the amount of non-administrative expenses that we see for one agency, and understand what kind of distribution we see there. In this case, we see that 38% of the budget, of the non-administrative budget of one institution, this is, think of it in terms of one institution, 38% of resources, of non-administrative resources, are going to SDG target 16.6. 22% of non-administrative projects from that institution are going to finance or invest in SDG target 17.14. 9% of non-administrative projects of that ministry, department, or agency are going to SDG target 9.1, and so on. So what we want to do is apply that same distribution to those administrative expenses. So that's what we're going to cover today. How do we do that? Let's go back into the Excel file. So if you remember, we have this Excel file. In the case of the last video, we were focusing on those non-administrative expenses, which were this. We had an example that was covering program number 2 on the Department of Finance. We gave it some manual tagging at the narrative level using the framework for SDG targets that it can be downloaded online. And then we were able to determine what kind of financing we were going to distribute to the main SDG target as well as the secondary SDG targets. And we also mentioned how we need to use that information or distribute it in a horizontal way, right? So what we want to do right now is to be able to understand the behavior of those non-administrative expenses for each institution. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new tab with many columns, but let's start by getting a list of all the institutions that we see available. We don't want them repeated. That's why we're going to use the unique formula within the Excel file. The unique formula, and we're also going to sort it in alphabetical order. And what we're going to do here is we're taking the vector that has all the institutions in our budget, and then we're basically making sure that we get them only once. That's why we're using the unique formula. Once you apply that, you don't need to go row by row. You automatically get the entire list of, in this case, 81 institutions that have budget associated to it. Okay, so that's that have investment, or also in order to avoid confusion, all those institutions have non-administrative expenses in their budget. So based on that, we're going to create another column that will replicate the binary nature. In this case, we're actually going to have only one digit for non-administrative expenses. And you'll see why this is needed later on. But for now, I want you to move to the next column, and we're going to do the same formula that we did before, the sum ifs, which is basically a way to add information based on some conditionals that we apply. So in this case, we're asking the computer to go back to that formula, to that data, that original data, take into account the column that relates to the budget, and we want that column to have some criteria. So we're saying within that column, please add those components that are related to, take into account that it's non-administrative, and then go look for those non-administrative expenses that that are related to the condition that we're putting here, that are basically non-administrative, and then take that into account for the agency that we are selecting here, for the list of each agency. So once you get that, once you hit that formula, you will calculate the total amount of non-administrative expenses for each agency. So now what we want to do is to distribute it in a horizontal way, just like we did in the previous video. So in order to do that, we're going to do the same sum ifs that we used in the previous video, and then we're going to do a similar exercise. We want to, for column number 1, we want the computer to go back to the original budget file, look for that column, and associate the resources that correspond to SDG target, in this case number 1, right? Since we didn't associate anything to SDG target with the code 1, then that's why we don't get anything. But the more you go through on a horizontal way, you will see that some resources start showing up. In this case, we almost got 90% of the resources between SDG targets 3 and 4, 3 and 5, with the codes 3 and 5. So what you want to do is first create 170 columns, and then start spreading that formula, being very careful on how to how you pull that formula horizontally. But whenever you get those 170 columns, remember that we have one for the non-applicable. You want to have another control. Remember that we like to use controls a lot to make sure that we don't count more than we need to, and that in order to make sure that we use the total amount of resources, in this case for non-administrative resources. So as you can see, once we spread that formula, being very careful, you'll find the total amount of financing that exists for each SDG target, only taking into account non-administrative expenses. However, if you remember from the file, from the PowerPoint that we showed at the beginning, we want to get the percentage of non-administrative expenses for one institution. So the way we do that is we create another set of 170 columns, where we're going to divide each amount into the total investment for that particular institution. Remember that horizontally we have only one institution, in this case the Agency of Social Protection, and we're going to divide that amount that is all the way horizontally over there, divided by this column to get the percentage. And that's what happens here. We're dividing that amount by that total investment. So what you find once you carefully distribute that formula to the other columns, you want to make sure that you get it right, that all the 170 columns add up to 100%. You are going to get this distribution. You're going to get the percentages for non-administrative expenses. So we haven't actually started talking about. We haven't even gone to the treatment of administrative expenses. So that's what we're going to do right now. Once you have all that information in terms of the behavior of non-administrative, you go back to the file, and instead of focusing on non-administrative expenses, you go and focus and filter for those administrative expenses. In the case of the Department of Finance, remember that we are doing it only for one institution. You get the total amount of, this is the total amount that is in the original budget file for program number 1 of the Department of Finance, which is governance, management, and administration. So you don't want to mess with any of these columns because you already have very useful information on the other tab. So what we're going to do here is, instead of using the sum ifs formula that we used before, we want to use an XLOOKUP because we want to look that information. We want to get the percentage that we found before, and we want to allocate that to that percentage to this amount of resources. So that's why we're asking the computer to go and look for that agency. Go look for that agency in the file that we just created, and then get the information for column number 1 at the level of the percentage, right? Once you get that percentage, everything that is contained here, you're going to get a percentage. Now you're going to multiply it by the amount of non-administrative resources, which is what we calculated before. So that's what is going to give us the total amount of, or the imputation. This is where we are translating the behavior. We're bringing the percentage of the investment behavior onto the administrative expense. Once you carefully navigate that file and expand that formula and extend it to all other columns, you're going to be able to create a control to make sure that when you add up all those columns, you are actually adding up to the entirety of the non-administrative total amount of resources that you have originally in your budget file. So once you have that, you have basically done the treatment of non-administrative and administrative expenses. So what you will see is you will see a file that has, again, the same information that you have on your PDF file for the budget. You have a series of columns that are related to the narrative alignment or tagging of each budget line into the 169 SG targets. Then you're going to have a series of columns that tell you what kind of distribution you need to do within each row for the main SG target that you chose, as well as the secondary ones. And then, as we have mentioned before, you want to see that in a horizontal way. That'll make it easy to do the treatment for the visuals later on. So once you have that, you should have a horizontal matrix that has the treatment of both administrative and non-administrative expenses in that. That's all. That's once you finish this component, you have covered everything that you need for the SDG budget tag. You all have already compiled an SDG budget tag. Now, what we want to do in the next video is to do the treatment of that data to make it visual. So basically, we are finishing the technical part, and then we are moving on in the next video to the visual component of showing the data, how you want to show the data in those 17 columns that we show at the beginning. And so in order to get to that, we're going to do another video, which will be the last video, and it's basically going to be focused only on the visual component. So I'll see you in the next video. And remember that there are 2 procedures for the SDG budget tag up until this point. You want to do the treatment of non-administrative expenses, and then you want to do the treatment of administrative expenses. That's what we just did. That's what the SDG tag is about. And now we're moving on to the next phase of the SDG budget tag, which is the visual component, the one related to data visualization. So I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.